All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to Maui Ocean Center's Sea Talk series. My name is Colleen Foster and I'm the Director of Education. Thank you so much for all joining us tonight. Our guest speaker is Dr. Will Howard, but before we get started, a little bit about the format. The talk will go from approximately 6 o'clock to 6:45, and then for about 15 minutes we'll have time for Q&A. So please do hold your questions until the end. And then at 7 o'clock, we'll try to end on time. We'll give it a few extra minutes since we started a few extra minutes late. Yeah, they're having a good time now. See, yeah, I can't compete with that. The wallpaper is way too interesting in this room. All right, I think they're done now. They'll just keep an eye on it. It'll go on all night. Anyway, so, but after we end, Dr. Howard has agreed graciously to answer a few questions on the side as we're breaking down the room. So there'll be more opportunities after that. And if you don't have questions, you can always help us by grabbing a chair as we break down. But anyway, so tonight, Dr. Will Howard is joining us all the way from Australia, where he is a visiting fellow at Australia National University Research School of Earth Sciences, as well as the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, University of Tasmania. Dr. Howard has a PhD in geological sciences from the Brown University in the U.S. He was a U.S. Department of Energy Global Change Distinguished Postdoctoral Fellow at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University, a lecturer in oceanography at the Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, and a researcher at the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems Cooperative Research Center in Hobart until 2010, and Assistant Director Science at the Office of the Chief Scientist at Canberra from 2010 to 2013. So he will be presenting on the impacts of global ocean acidification on the past, present, and future ocean, and how continued monitoring of these effects will be vital for policymakers, the public, and scientific communities. So without further delay, please help me provide a very warm welcome to Dr. Will Howard.
It's wonderful. Thanks, Colleen. Is that on now? Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And it will be hard to compete with that display. But I did give this talk out on the Great Barrier Reef, and it was really rough seas, and people were actually seasick. So this is actually a much more benign environment than I was there. So thanks so much for that. And I just want to say that my role now is mostly a policy role. I provide science advice to the Australian government on all areas of science. But I like to keep coming back to marine science, and it gets me back to my own roots. So I'd like to talk about ocean acidification as a process that I think not a lot of policymakers have been seriously thinking about. They've been thinking about climate change. Of course, they just came back from Marrakesh talking about that. And for a few years, some of my colleagues and I have been talking about a different process and a different consequence of anthropogenic human emissions into the atmosphere. So I want to talk about what we understand about the science, what we don't understand yet, what some of the future challenges are in understanding that science, and of course the biggest question of all, what do we do about it? So we'll talk a bit about that as well. So I guess I'll just get going. So one of the things I want to talk about is thinking about this really needs a consideration of really long periods of time. We're not used to thinking about time periods much longer than probably our own lifetimes, a few decades. But to think about this problem, you really have to go back. In this case, I'm going back 400,000 years. And that blue line is atmospheric carbon dioxide, which you've probably seen. Al Gore, I think, showed a similar graph in his movie, The Inconvenient Truth. And what this shows is this cyclic change in carbon dioxide. And to the right of that is another graph. So that goes from 400,000 years to something like a few thousand years ago. And then everything kind of levels out for about the last 1,500 years or so. And then all of a sudden, at about 1,700 and something, atmospheric carbon dioxide starts going up. This graph is already out of date. We're now over 400 parts per million by volume. So humans not only are having an effect on the atmosphere, but we're having an accelerating effect. So this effect that we're having, that bit right there, is happening at least tens times faster than anything happening that we know about from the geological record, which is that stuff over there. And I just should point out that because I'm a geologist, sometimes I don't mind time running backwards. It drives my physics friends crazy. So I'm trying to get everything with time running from left to right. And I should say that, going back to that, no, we'll stay here, but if we expand our time frame even further, and now, we went back to that, I just want to say that some people really ask, well, is it really humans driving that carbon dioxide increase? And of course, those black squares are measured not far from here at Mauna Loa. It's the longest continuous observations of CO2 in the atmosphere by Dave Keeling, and now other people continuing that. People say, well, could that just be coming out of volcanoes, or is it just dissolving out of the ocean or something like that? And the answer is no. And we know that because we can measure the chemistry of that carbon dioxide. We can tell that it comes from burning fossil fuels because actually the oxygen content of the atmosphere is going down slightly. You're not going to asphyxiate now, but it is going down in a measurable way, and it's exactly what you expect if you were burning a lot of organic matter. And a number of other, quite a few other constraints. So for someone to argue that this isn't due to humans would have to really come up with a convincing hypothesis that took into account all these data. If we go back even further in time, and this is the last really big geological thing I'm going to show you, now we're starting sort of at the present, going back 60 million years or so. We know that the pre-industrial level is like about 280. There are times in the past when CO2 has been quite a bit higher. It's been up around 2,000 parts per million by volume. By the end of the century, we'll probably be at about that level. And that level is an interesting threshold because when carbon dioxide came down through that threshold, we first started getting big ice sheets in Antarctica. So the Earth's climate really went through a big evolution into what is now arguably, in some ways, an ice age. Well, it is in Antarctica and Greenland. But we're now, at least one of the major forces that drove that evolution is now being reversed by us. So it's not clear, at what point we go back through that threshold and start melting all that ice, but arguably we've already started. So I just want to make that point that humans are really now a geological process on the Earth. So we put a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, about a little over 10 billion tons of carbon, that's about 37 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Mostly it's because of fossil fuels. To some extent it's due to land use change. We take down rainforests, convert forests into agricultural land, and that releases a lot of carbon dioxide as well. So the main thing there is that we're putting a bit over 10 tons of carbon as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The atmosphere itself takes up about 45% of that or so, and that's what's causing global warming already to happen. But about a third of that, 30% or so, is taken back up by land. The plants do absorb some of that carbon dioxide, but the part I really want to talk about is that the ocean takes up about, in that decade, takes up just about a quarter of all that carbon dioxide. So that, from the perspective of climate change, is a nice favor that the ocean is doing for us, but it has consequences for the ocean itself. And that's what I want to talk about. And you can just see that you start in 1880, you can just see this increased use of fossil fuels, and in industry, things like concrete produces CO2. So that's going up and up and up. That's all that gray stuff. And where is it all going? Some of it's going into the ocean, a lot of it into the atmosphere, some into land. Actually, we're doing better, I should say. Over the last few decades, we've been doing better on reducing land. So I'm going to go back there one more time. Now, there we go. That's where I want to be. So, a few things I want to say. This is the last chemistry slide I'm going to show. So this is going to bring you back to your high school chemistry class a bit. And this looks really complicated, but there's only a couple things you really need to know about all this. And that is, quite simply, carbon dioxide, when it dissolves into water, unlike other gases, it forms a weak acid. It actually turns into something called carbonic acid, and that forms a few ions. That H plus is what makes acidity. So you remember from high school, pH is an index of how much of that H is in the water. Some of you may even remember that it's minus the log base 10 of the hydrogen ion concentration. But I won't test you on that. I'll just trust that you remember that from high school chemistry. So it's this dissociation into hydrogen and bicarbonate, and then into something else that's carbonate. That's the major buffering mechanism of the ocean. So the ocean right now is a slightly alkaline solution. So you remember that 7 is neutral pH. Anything below that is an acid. So, vinegar is 3 or something, I think, 3 point something. The ocean is about 8.1, 8.2. And one of the things that causes that buffering is the ocean's ability to shift carbon from this bicarbonate stuff to this carbonate stuff right there. And in doing so, either take up one of those hydrogens or give it off. And you all see this on these medical shows. You see this played out. The guy's on the gurney there, and ER, and he stopped breathing. What's the thing that the doc is yelling for? Stat. Bicarb, exactly. And the reason is that the person is not breathing, they're not getting rid of that CO2, and their blood pH needs to be stabilized. Okay, veterinarian, well, it's the same physiology. Exactly. We're all mammals together. It's the same chemistry going on in your bloodstream, and your blood can't tolerate, well, you can tell me what, your bloodstream can tolerate a change in pH of about 0.1, 0.2 at the most. You go up or down more than that, and you're in physiological strife. So your bloodstream is a very buffered solution, and so is the ocean in the sense that it's got these buffers within it. But here's the thing that happens. So as we move through all this stuff, we make it more acid. But what the ocean does is it uses some of this carbonate ion to suck up one of those hydrogen ions and makes them bicarbonate, and in that process buffer itself. But the problem is that there's a whole bunch of shell-making organisms, corals, seashells, and a bunch of others that I'll show you in a minute, that actually depend on that carbonate ion to make those shells. And so as we add more CO2, we're reducing that carbonate at the expense to make more bicarbonate. Everybody with me so far? All right. So this is happening. This is not in a model. This is not a hypothesis. We can see this happening. And in fact, the two of the longest observational stations are one, Mauna Loa, up on the Big Island, and Station Aloha, just north of Oahu, where we can see some of the longest time series. So there's that red thing is atmospheric CO2. It's going up and up and up. And again, it stopped. That one stopped. So we're already up above this threshold here. pH is that blue thing. It's inevitably it's going down. The CO2 in the water is going up. And what we call the saturation state, the ability of these little shells to not only make a shell, but keep a shell, keep it from dissolving, sort of like osteoporosis, is we measure it by this little omega thing. And all that means is that when that's over 1, it means if you've made a shell, it's going to stay preserved in seawater. If it's under 1, it's going to dissolve. So far, for these particular the organisms that make this stuff, calcite, this is going down, down and down and down, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. The point is that these observations are exactly what the theory that I showed in the previous slide would have led us to expect. So this is a case of how science happens. You have a hypothesis, you have a theory, and guess what? The observations confirm it. So the ocean has already, over the whole 200 years or so that we've had big industries, it's taken up about 42% of all our carbon dioxide. And this map kind of shows you where a lot of that uptake is going. And this is just, a lot of it is in the North Atlantic and a lot of it is in the Southern Ocean. And that's because these two bits of ocean are very cold. And everybody here who's a beer drinker knows that if you leave a cold beer, if you put a cold beer, open it, put it in the fridge, it'll stay fizzy for a little while. If you put it out on the table, it'll go flat pretty quick because carbon dioxide, unlike a lot of other gases, is more soluble in cold water. So these cold waters are taking up more of the carbon dioxide. They're not just taking it up, but they're overturning. So in the Atlantic, this is where this so-called conveyor belt works, and that's cold waters sinking to the bottom of the ocean and spreading near the bottom of the ocean. Now, in the Southern Ocean is the same thing. It's cold waters that turn over right from the top all the way to the bottom. So every bit of water not only has a chance to take up a bit of carbon dioxide, but take it down deep where it can't be seen again by the atmosphere and outgas again. So we've been looking at, it's happening all over the ocean, but it's happening most dramatically in those places. So that's what's driving this acidification. And the other point to make is that this stuff, this red is where most of the anthropogenic, the extra CO2 is going. I should point out that measuring that extra bit of CO2 is really not easy. It's actually a difficult thing to do because the ocean already had quite a high concentration of carbon dioxide. So figuring out how much of the carbon dioxide that's in the ocean now comes from us turns out to be a tricky thing, partly because it's not that easy to measure, and partly because you have to distinguish, carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide, or seems to be. So we've done a lot of work on that. And this perturbation is coming from the top, obviously. Everywhere the ocean is in contact with the atmosphere, which is almost everywhere there is ocean, the CO2 is coming in. And again, you can see it coming. These diagrams are going down to like 3,000 meters in the ocean. Sorry, I talk in meters, but that's over 9,000 feet in the ocean. So the buffering mechanism, again, here's a little bit of chemistry for you. Once you go, this is this carbonate ion concentration. It's high at the surface, and it's actually a function of pressure too. So it gets lower and lower as you go deeper. And the minerals that normally get deposited on the bottom of the ocean dissolve once it's very, very deep. So that's a normal mechanism by which the ocean just keeps itself in balance over long periods of time. That's why the ocean's pH has been relatively stable for probably millions of years. It hasn't varied a lot. That's because it's got this. So you imagine, it's like taking a Tums or something like that when you have an upset stomach. Problem is that by the time the upset gets to the Tums, it's gonna take a while, and that's a problem. So ultimately, the ocean will buffer all the CO2 that we can throw at it, but it'll take a long time. And we can tell this because we have some models that we can throw a model and we can say, let's just chuck a whole bunch of carbon dioxide at it and see how long it takes the buffering to take place. And this thing goes for about 1,000 years with chucking a lot of carbon dioxide into the ocean. And then it takes like 10,000 years to bring that back down. So that's a very long period of time to wait around. The question is, what do we do between now and 10,000 years from now? We can see this in the geological past. I think we mentioned that I'm a geologist, and one of the things we look at is how this plays out in the past. And we've had cases in the geological record. We had one about 55 million years ago where a huge amount of carbon dioxide was injected, partly as carbon dioxide, partly as methane, into the atmosphere and the ocean. And one of the things we can see is that the calcium carbonate, and that's plotted backwards. There's a lot of calcium carbonate down, and that's like 0 calcium carbonate. That's this TUM stuff. You can see within about 10,000 years at this site, there's no calcium carbonate left. And then it slowly comes back, but it takes about 100,000 years for that chemistry to restore itself. So this is where the problem is. So I mentioned earlier, so the question is, what happens in the meantime? So in the meantime, what happens is there's a whole lot of organisms that are making shell material. And again, this is all corals and a whole bunch of other organisms, seashells, everything you see, when you snorkel in a sandy lagoon is largely this calcium carbonate mineral, and it's made out of this carbonate ion. So there's a whole bunch of organisms that are making these shell materials. There's a coral, big Porites mound in the Great Barrier Reef. At the other end of the size spectrum is this little coccolithophorid, and those little rings are calcium carbonate. If you go to some place like the White Cliffs of Dover, the White Cliffs of Dover are made out of those little plates. So they're tiny. They're only a few microns in diameter, but there's millions of them. And these little coccolithophorids, they're one-celled algae. About 1 out of every 2 oxygen molecule you breathe in, you can thank one of these coccolithophorids for it, because that's about how much of the Earth's atmospheric oxygen they produce. And they're quite vulnerable because part of their physiology depends on them making those little calcium carbonate plates, tiny things. One of my favorite little organisms is a little foraminifer, and that's a one-celled organism, sort of like an amoeba, but with a shell. And it's just about the size, in reality, of about a grain of sand. But again, there's countless numbers of these in the ocean. And we use them in a number of ways, which I'll get to in a second. But they're also integral into the marine ecosystems because they're part of the plankton. But these organisms also do another thing. Because they produce this slightly heavy and dense mineral, they're responsible for transporting a lot of carbon into the deep part of the ocean. And then we have, again, another little, it's actually a pelagic snail called a pteropod. And these things are snails. They float around in the ocean. There's little feet. Like most snails have a little foot that's kind of sitting on the bottom. These have actually evolved into little wing-like appendages that effectively they kind of fly around. They really look like they're flying through the water. And those shells are also made out of this calcium carbonate. So there's a few organisms likely to be affected by this. The other point about a lot of these organisms is that they are ecological engineers. In other words, they make the habitats they live in. Corals are the classic example of this. But there's a whole lot of others. You're used to thinking about living in Hawaii. You're very used to thinking about tropical coral reefs, of course, because you've got so many beautiful ones. But these same kind of organisms build reefs in environments you would not normally think of as a reef place. Some of these deep corals here actually are off the coast of Antarctica, where just a few years ago we discovered really extensive reefs in really freezing cold water. So there's reef builders even in cold waters. There's things like sea urchins, which you sometimes see on the bottom. Those little needles are also made of calcium carbonate. There are these things that are not the prettiest looking thing in the world. There's this little thing called a crustose coralline algae. And all it is an algae that makes a calcium carbonate crust. If you take the time to go underneath the coral heads in one of these reefs and just spend a moment before you go back up, you'll see a lot of this purplish, crusty stuff. It's not really great to look at, but it's extremely important to the reef environment because what it's doing is gluing together the reef structure and stabilizing it. And we think that they're similarly vulnerable to this process of acidification. There's bryozoans, which are little also reef-building animals that are very abundant in very temperate environments, like off the south coast of Australia or off New Zealand. So there's a wide range of organisms who are building habitats likely to be affected. So I'm just going to go back to that. So the general idea is the more we add CO2, the less of this carbonate ion we have, the less these critters can make their shells. But it's actually more complex than that. And you must have known that was coming. So it turns out that, and all these little graphs are just like what happens to organisms' growth when you add more carbon dioxide. And it turns out some of them are deleteriously harmed. They grow less. Some of them actually like it. So it's not all bad. It's not all bad for all things. Some organisms will actually be happy with more carbon dioxide. This thing just shows that, some things have a positive effect. Crustaceans, a lot of crustaceans that are happier with more carbon dioxide. Most corals are not. Most echinoderms, those little urchins, are not. But this is the part where it really gets complicated. This is the part where a simple problem gets complicated for people like me, because organisms have all kinds of complex physiological ways of tricking the chemistry into doing what they want to do. And this paper just came out, in fact, just came out today. Some of my colleagues in Australia were involved in this. And ocean acidification, they're saying, can shift some of these habitats. And their point in this paper, which I just looked at this morning, is that some ecosystems will actually win out. Coral reefs won't, but seaweed-dominated ecosystems, some of them might actually win out. So that's good if you're a seaweed. It's bad if you're a coral. And that's the thing we have to understand about. Also, organisms, again, their ability to respond is sometimes quite remarkable. Two, Miles Fine and Dan Chernoff, working in the Red Sea, took some corals, scleractinians. They're these usual little corals that make the reefs, and they subjected them to high carbon dioxide, low pH, and they found the most interesting thing that these things, as you know, probably are colonial organisms. There's millions of little polyps in one coral head, making this shell back behind them. These things turn themselves into solitary, completely decalcified organisms. In other words, they turn themselves into a sea anemone, effectively. And then when they restored the chemistry back to what it was before, they went back to being colonial reef-building organisms. So if you're worried about the extinction of whatever that species is, this is a good news story for you. If you're worried about reef habitats being able to maintain themselves, this is a very worrying story. So it's not about extinction, it's about the alteration of ecosystems. So, go ahead. That they just did that within like days or weeks. That was very quick. That happened pretty quickly. So, that wasn't an evolutionary timescale. That was an experimental timescale. So these organisms, some of them are quite adaptable. So it's not easy for us to experiment on these things. We can experiment on individual organisms. So I can take a bit of coral or some little critter and stick it in a tank and change the pH. But what we really want to know is how does the whole ecosystem respond? And that's not an easy thing to experiment on. One way to do it is to find places where nature is actually injecting carbon dioxide into the ecosystem over long periods of time. And one place that's really handy for scientists is a volcanic field off of Papua New Guinea in the Western Pacific. And there's a place where volcanic carbon dioxide is just bubbling into the water. So it's a natural experiment where the whole ecosystem is being subjected to this input of carbonate. And so A is quite a ways away from the input of bubbling CO2, and you can see it looks pretty much like the kind of reef you're probably used to seeing, maybe snorkeling off the islands here. You get a bit closer, you can actually see the bubbles. You can see that there's a lot less coral. Some of it is not alive, and you can see that green color. Some of that isn't living coral. It's algae growing on the coral, or algae. When you get really close to the CO2, you've got a lot of green algae, but basically you've got a dead reef. So this is kind of this gives us a glimpse into the future. So it's not a dead ecosystem. It's just an ecosystem dominated by things other than the coral reefs. So these folks, mostly from Australia with some American colleagues, have sought out this kind of a setting. I've done this a different way. I've said, let's go into the past where nature has actually changed the CO2, and I showed that earlier. And it's changed the ocean chemistry accordingly. And let's see what the organisms did in that time in the past. And again, that gray thing is that carbon dioxide going up and down in the past, back to 200,000 years ago or so. And this blue thing is actually the calcification, or the weights of those little foraminifera that I showed you a picture of earlier. And the beauty of the foraminifera is that we can drill cores into the bottom, and we can pick them up from just about any age we want. So we can see what they were doing in that context. And you can see they were really sensitive to CO2. In fact, I showed somebody this blue curve, and they thought it was the ice core air bubble CO2 record. They did a better job of recording CO2 than the CO2 did. So one of the things we can see is that these organisms respond pretty much like you expect them to. When CO2 is added to the system, they respond by making smaller shells. I plotted that backwards again. That's another trick that we geologists do, just to keep everybody on their toes. They made lighter shells. In the glacial, when the pH was greater, they made heavier shells. And we know that the pH was higher in these glacial intervals because we have some other proxies, which I won't talk about at the moment. A proxy is just something where we can't have been there ourselves. We have to use some geochemical trick to actually infer what was happening at the time. So we try to observe the system in situ. We said, well, this is what the system was like over the last 200,000 years. And we said, well, carbon dioxide has now gone up almost to 400 parts per million. It's up over here. So what are these same little organisms doing now? And the other beauty, which I forgot to mention, is not only have these organisms been living and dying in the ocean and falling to the bottom conveniently for us to collect them, but they're living, same species, in the ocean now. So we could actually, again, run the same kind of hypothesis. Well, if this is what they were doing in the past, what they should be doing now is making even lighter shells, because the ocean has taken up that much more CO2. And we go out. This is the Aurora Australis, which is Australia's icebreaker, soon to be replaced by a new ship. We go out. It's a bit rough out there where we go. When we go down into the Southern Ocean, that place where I showed you a lot of CO2 is being taken up. So it's a great experiment for us. And not a lot else has happened. It hasn't warmed as quickly as some of the other parts of the ocean. So we can actually take cores, just driving a pipe down into the kind of soft mud of the bottom. And that's what that stuff looks like. It's this tan, kind of nondescript looking stuff. But what's in it, and that's just an echogram from an echo sounder. So that just shows us layers of this sediment back that's down like about 100 meters deep. We couldn't take a 100-meter core right there, but we took about a 30-meter core. That's not 30. That's just about 3 meters. But we can go back in time. This was off of Tasmania, and that's, I don't know why, those got out of order. So that's what that is. That's back down a core. Let's go quicker. But then we can capture the modern ones. And we do that by catching them in something we call a sediment trap. That's us deploying the sediment trap. And yes, the deck is awash with water. At one point, I think we were up to our waists in freezing Antarctic water. And these cones actually catch the organisms, because what they do is they live up in the surface waters, and ultimately they die and sink, and we can catch them just at the point where they've just sunk, and we know exactly what time we caught them. And we can pick them up and ask the question, how do they compare to their pre-industrial friends? And here's some pictures. This one got the sort of like being on the cover of the Rolling Stone, having your fossil, on the cover of Nature Geoscience. It's a big deal for geologists like me. So my little critter there was one of the ones that we caught in these sediment traps. And these were the ones that were just laying on the sea bottom before humans got involved. And you can see that right down from the surface, well, near the surface, down to about 5,000 meters, on average, that's their weight. They start getting smaller because actually they start dissolving once they're deep enough in the ocean. But the modern ones were lighter. And they were lighter by just about the amount we would have expected by knowing how much the carbon dioxide had invaded that water. So again, this is a natural experiment we didn't have to do in the lab. We did it in nature. So that was good. My student, Andrew Moy, did that. I told him this is the one moment, you better just remember this. It doesn't happen often in science that you create a hypothesis, go out and test it, and it actually comes out the way you expected. So hopefully he savored that moment. We can look at some of the other collecting things in those same sediment traps. We've had those traps out there for over a decade. And some of the other shell-making organisms in the ocean have also, over time, started making, it's not a really great trend, but they've started making, we think, slightly lighter and lighter and lighter shells. Again, because we think they're forming in water that's not conducive to them making a shell and keeping a shell. And these organisms are actually made out of a form of calcium carbonate that's a little more vulnerable to this dissolution. In fact, it's the same form of carbonate that corals are made out of, called aragonite. We can see that the calcification rates of some of these corals. So I showed this picture of this big Porites coral. And one of the things you can do is drill through it, and you can see these bands, and they're like tree rings. So they started when the coral started growing, and you can actually measure how much shell material the coral put down in each year. You can measure both the extension rate, how thick is the ring, and how dense is the ring. You can tell then how much carbonate it's making. And it turns out that on the Great Barrier Reef, starting from about the 1960s or so, we started seeing lower and lower calcification rates in these corals. It's not a perfect experiment because other things are happening in the reef other than acidification. So we can't quite say it's just acidification. There's other factors too, but it's very likely that acidification plays some role in this. So what's going to happen in the future? Again, we're back to something kind of simple in the sense that the more CO2 we put into the atmosphere, the more is going to go into the ocean and the lower the ocean pH. Again, the pre-industrial ocean was about 8.2, and we're headed to a future, if we keep emitting at the way we're emitting, down to about 7.7, 7.8. Now that's still a basic solution, but for a lot of organisms, it represents a huge change in chemistry for them. Now, these are just, now is about this vertical line. So what we do in the future, we don't know yet. That's a bit up to us. But if we just keep burning fossil fuels and emitting the way we're emitting, we're sort of putting the ocean on this kind of a trajectory. And there's a couple things that happen with these kind of scenarios. So if we say, this is a nice map, and it shows this. This is omega aragonite. So this is just the propensity of this mineral to not only be made, but stay stable. Anything that's blue is up in a high number. If it's below 1, that stuff's just dissolving. They can't even stay as a dead shell. So you can look at the pre-industrial ocean and kind of work backwards and say, look, there's a lot of blue there. Things were quite favorable to reefs. All that blue and green and yellow is good. If we get to 500, and again, we're at 400 now, so we're not far away, we have no more blue. Things are not ideal, but they're still okay for a lot of reefs in the tropics. If we get to 1,000, then things will not be favorable for reefs anywhere. So that's a serious problem. And these places in the polar oceans are sort of pink and white, and that just means anything trying to make a shell not only can't make it, but can't keep it either. So that's a serious problem. So the reefs, which you probably know already, are actually mostly not living organisms. The living bit is just the thin skin. If you look at a coral head, the living polyps are just right on the surface. But what's below that is all the skeletal material. Those corals and calcareous algae and foraminifera and a whole bunch of other organisms are building these reefs, and they're building them up. And Hawaii is a great example of that. You see the fringing reefs around the newer islands. When you go northwest down the hotspot track, you see these atolls. And this is not news. Darwin knew this. Darwin hypothesized this already, and everything we've done since has only confirmed Darwin's hypothesis about this. But the problem is that as these islands sink or sea level comes up, reef growth normally keeps up. So sea level is coming up or the island's sinking or a bit of both, and reefs tend to grow right up to the near subsurface. So this is a serious problem for reefs maintaining their structure because normally they keep up with sea level. We're now driving sea level up at a rate, it's not huge, it's about 3.2 millimeters per year, so it's not massive, but it's quite inexorable. And at the same time, we're compromising the ability of all these organisms who build reefs to build and keep those reefs. And not only that, but even within the reef limestone, and I can show you some other, there's a whole lot of organisms that bore and drill their way into that reef structure. And that tends to erode the reef. So the reef is there because it's growing faster than it's eroding. It's not that it's never dissolving. It is dissolving. It's just like a snow line or something like that. The snow line is where the snow is falling not fast enough for it to accumulate. So these reefs accumulate in part because they can keep up with sea level. So not only does ocean acidification reduce the ability of the reef builders to build that material, it accelerates the activity of all the little worms and sponges and a whole lot of other organisms that are actually drilling and boring their way through the reef structure. So that's a serious problem. And I think we're hitting these reefs now with kind of a double whammy. We're hitting them with accelerating sea level change at the same time as we're compromising their ability to keep up. And again, we can see these kind of scenarios. Jack Silverman and his colleagues did a really interesting paper where they said, well, let's measure the percentage of PR. That's just how much of reef growth actually stays there and doesn't dissolve away. So under close to what we are now, we're still okay. Somewhere between 60 and 80% of what the reefs build can still accumulate and build more reefs. But as we get higher, and again, we're not that far away from 450 parts per million. This goes down now, maybe half of it gets, well, by the time we get to double, that's 560, double the pre-industrial level, the reefs are actually having a hard time. And finally, they just simply can't keep up with the input of CO2. So this is a real challenge for the reefs. And I should note that people have talked about sort of geoengineering scenarios for cooling down the Earth. So putting mirrors up in space or injecting sulfate into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back into space and counteract the effects of global warming. These are all things that scientists have been talking about. They will do nothing to solve the ocean acidification problem because the acidification problem has nothing to do with greenhouse gases acting as greenhouse gases. It has all to do with carbon dioxide as a chemical in water, in other words, as an acid. So you're not going to solve the problem this way. So I'm almost done. And yep, I see that 5-minute thing. I'm almost done here. So why do we even care about this? It's a fair enough question. I have to talk to policymakers all the time. So it is a question I anticipate from them. It's a fair enough question. Who cares? One reason is that a lot of the organisms that are at risk are at or near the base of some of the main oceanic food webs, those little plankton organisms. And similarly, a lot of the calcifiers create benthic environments. So corals create an environment in which all these other organisms live and depend. And again, it's not just tropical reefs. Some of these other habitats might even be more vulnerable than reefs. So the other point from a policy perspective is that this process is mostly independent of global warming. It doesn't depend on CO2 being a greenhouse gas. It only depends on it being a chemical in water. And you might have to think about different targets. Our politicians just came back from Marrakesh reiterating their problem or their promise to keep the Earth from warming any more than 2 degrees C, which is a good goal to have. But what they haven't promised to do is keep the ocean from acidifying any further. And we haven't identified for them in a simple way, this is a scientific challenge, what thresholds the ocean might go through that we're not going to be able to come back from. And I think this is a scientific challenge. We haven't identified them, so we don't know yet exactly what those might be. Should say that people talk a lot about predicting the future, predicting the fate of climate in the future. We already know this is happening. I don't know exactly to what extent it's good or bad and for whom, but it's already changing ecosystems. And we really need to understand what this means for ecosystems. I've studied the Southern Ocean because it's kind of a hot spot. It's taking up a lot of CO2. There's other places that really need this kind of attention, especially coral reefs. And one thing that makes it really difficult in science is that we actually need to go and watch these ecosystems and then not just go away. Funding agencies have a really hard time with continuing to watch something over decades and decades because it doesn't seem new to them. Indeed, the National Science Foundation tried to shut down Dave Keeling many times because they said it wasn't new science. And if they had shut him down, then we wouldn't know what we know. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'll take some questions.
Well, again, as we're breaking down the room, if you have additional questions for Dr. Howard, feel free to ask. If you don't have a question, help us take a chair out the room. Thank you so much again for coming tonight to the Sea Talk. Something we started doing, I think about 8 months ago, was we take these Sea Talks and we edit them into a video and we put them on our Maui Ocean Center YouTube website. So if you've missed some of our Sea Talks, jump on there. This one will probably be on there in about 2 to 4 weeks. We'll get it on there, but there's about 5 or 6 others. So get on there and enjoy those Sea Talks when you can. And keep an eye out for your emails. We'll let you know when the next one comes up. So thank you again.